I couldn't believe it when the phone rang that morning. The voice on the other end was trembling, barely recognizable, and I could hear the panic and disbelief in my sister's words. Sarah was crying. She was in absolute shock, barely able to get the words out. My house, it's gone. They demolished it. Those words hit me like a freight train. My mind raced as I tried to process what she was saying. My sister Sarah had been away on a business trip to Chicago for the past few days. She'd left her home in what she thought was a safe neighborhood, a place where she could work, relax, and come back to after a long trip. Now, all she had was a wreckage where her house used to stand. She didn't even know how to react, so she called me, her brother, the one person she could count on to make sense of this madness. My first instinct was to get in my car and head straight over to her. I could hear her sobs through the phone, and it broke my heart. "I'll be there in a few hours, hang on, Sarah," I told her. But as I hung up, I couldn't help but wonder, who would do something so extreme? Why would anyone tear down someone's home, especially without warning? My mind was already racing with questions, and I knew I was about to walk into something big. When I finally reached her neighborhood, I could barely process what I was seeing. I parked the car and got out, walking slowly toward where her house had once stood. But there was nothing there. No walls, no windows, no roof. Just piles of concrete, wood, and rubble scattered across the lot. It was like a nightmare. I could feel my stomach drop as I scanned the area. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this, and they hadn't even cared enough to tell her they were going to tear down her home. It was a violent act, and I needed to find out who was behind it, and why. I saw Sarah standing there, motionless, her back to me. She wasn't even looking at me as I walked up. She was just staring at the pile of debris, the place where her life had been for so many years. When she finally turned to me, her face was pale, eyes red from crying. "How could this happen?" she whispered. I couldn't answer. I just hugged her tight. I didn't have the answers yet, but I would get them. It didn't take long for us to find some clues. As we walked around the wreckage, I noticed signs posted in the yard. HOA signs. I stopped and looked at one. "Future community garden coming soon," it read, with the HOA logo clearly visible on the bottom. A chill ran down my spine. That was it. That was the reason. The HOA had to be involved in this. The more I looked around, the more certain I became. They were behind this. Sarah never received any notice about a garden or a demolition. There were no letters, no emails, nothing. She'd been blindsided, and I knew that wasn't just a coincidence. We'd soon learn that the new HOA president was none other than Karen Winters, a name that was already beginning to ring alarm bells in my head. I'd heard rumors about her before. She had a reputation for being a bit too controlling, but I never imagined it would go this far. As we stood there, a neighbor I hadn't seen in years approached us. "Karen Winters did this," he said flatly. "She's been making trouble for everyone around here since she took over the HOA. Last year, things started getting ugly." I kept my anger in check, not wanting to reveal too much just yet. I'm the county sheriff in a neighboring town, but I didn't want anyone to know that yet. If they knew, they'd assume I was just here to protect my sister, and I didn't want to jump into the situation with my authority hanging over their heads. I wanted to handle this the right way, gather the facts first, and then, when the time was right, show them who they were dealing with. I turned to Sarah and said, "Don't worry. We'll figure this out. I'm going to find out everything that happened here, but I need you to trust me. Just let me take the lead for now." I could see the doubt in her eyes, but she nodded. I could tell she wanted answers. I wanted answers too. But before we did anything, I needed to investigate. I needed to know how deep this went. The next day, Sarah and I made our way to the Pinecrest HOA office. The building was a modest one, with an understated charm, but it still had that official, almost intimidating vibe. Pinecrest Homeowners Association was written in gold letters on the door. When we walked in, the receptionist barely acknowledged us at first. She was typing away on her computer, completely absorbed in her work. After a few moments, I cleared my throat and spoke up. "Excuse me, we need to speak with whoever handles demolition approvals," I said, my voice steady but firm. The woman looked up, clearly annoyed that we'd interrupted her. "That would be me," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Karen Winters, the president of the HOA. Do you have an appointment?" I glanced at Sarah, who was now visibly anxious, her fingers nervously tapping her side. I could feel her dread as we prepared to face Karen. I wasn't sure what kind of person Karen was, but if she had been behind the demolition, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Sarah stepped forward, her voice wavering with emotion. "I'm Sarah Johnson, and you demolished my house on Maple Street. While I was away, I want to know why," she said. Karen's reaction was far from sympathetic. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she sighed as if we were inconveniencing her and clicked away on her keyboard. "Ah, yes, 742 Maple Street," she said, almost dismissively. "That property was in serious violation of our community standards. We sent several notices. Several." Sarah's face went pale. "I never received any notices," she said, her voice shaking. "How could you just tear down someone's house like that?" Karen's expression hardened, and she finally looked up from her computer. "We absolutely can," she said, the smugness in her voice growing stronger. Section 8, paragraph 4 of the HOA agreement clearly states that after 3 violations, the association can take corrective action, and corrective action can mean demolition. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was a man of the law, and I knew what was legal and what wasn't. "You can't just demolish a house," I said, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. "There are rules, procedures, and permits for a reason." Karen rolled her eyes. The procedure was followed. The board voted on it. It was all very legal. I wasn't convinced, and I could see Sarah's distress growing. She was on the verge of breaking down again. I turned back to Karen. "I'd like to see the documents for these notices and the demolition approval," I said firmly. Karen's face grew colder. "Those are confidential HOA business," she said, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. "Only members of the HOA can see them." That was it. The gloves were off. I knew we weren't going to get anywhere with her, at least not today. "We're not leaving until we see those documents," I said, my tone final. Karen's patience wore thin, and she stood up. "I'll call security," she threatened, her voice laced with frustration. I turned to Sarah and put a hand on her shoulder. "We'll go for now," I said, my voice soft but resolute. "But this isn't over." As we walked out, Karen called after us. "The community garden will be much better than your eyesore of a house," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I turned to Sarah, who was once again fighting back tears. "She won't get away with this," I said firmly. "Not on my watch." We drove away in silence, but my mind was already racing. I wasn't done with Karen, not by a long shot. We drove back to my sister's neighborhood, the weight of the situation hanging heavily in the air. My mind was buzzing with frustration. Karen Winters had just brushed us off like we were nothing. She had the audacity to pretend everything she did was above board, that her illegal actions were justified by a set of rules no one but her seemed to understand. But I wasn't about to let this slide, not when my sister's life had been completely turned upside down. I knew I needed to get more than just her word, though. I needed solid proof. So, the next morning, I called in a favor. The city records department was one of the few places where I knew I could get some quick answers. I spoke to Linda, who worked there, We'd crossed paths before at county meetings, and I knew she wouldn't hesitate to help me out. "Linda, it's Liam Johnson. I need to check some records on a demolition permit. 742 Maple Street in Pinecrest. The one that was torn down recently. I need to know if anything was filed in the past month." She promised to get back to me shortly, and I waited, pacing the living room, not sure what to expect. A few minutes later, the phone rang. Linda's voice was calm, but I could hear the confusion in her tone. "This is strange, Liam. There's nothing here for 742 Maple Street. No demolition permit, no application, nothing. The last permit filed in that neighborhood was for a shed in the backyard, but that was 3 months ago." I was livid. Karen had lied. This wasn't just an issue of bad paperwork. This was an outright act of vandalism, of destruction without any legal basis. I thanked Linda and hung up. I knew I had to act fast. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a mistake. It was a deliberate and illegal act. I needed to dig deeper. Next, I set my sights on the demolition company that had actually done the work. I found the company's logo, Peterson Demolition, on some of the equipment still left on the property. It was a start. I tracked down the office across town and walked in, determined to get to the bottom of it. The owner, Mike Peterson, greeted me, though he seemed a little nervous, probably because he could tell I wasn't just a regular guy with a complaint. I didn't wear my sheriff's uniform, but I made sure to flash my badge when I introduced myself. "I'm investigating the demolition at 742 Maple Street," I said, trying to keep my tone professional, though inside, I was burning with anger. Mike didn't waste time defending himself. "Look, I just did what the HOA told me to do," he said, almost pleading. "They gave me all the paperwork, said it was good to go. Everything was official, or at least that's what they told me." I pressed him further. "Can I see the paperwork?" I asked. He hesitated, but after a few awkward moments, he led me to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. Inside was the authorization letter from the HOA. I took it, looking at the document carefully. It had the HOA's letterhead, Karen's signature, and a stamp that looked off. The stamp wasn't anything like what I'd seen from the city government, and there was no city permit number, no inspector's sign-off, just Karen's name, scribbled hastily. "Do you realize this is illegal?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Mike's face turned pale. "I didn't know it was that bad," he stammered. "They assured me everything was fine on their end." I could see he was scared. "This wasn't fine," I said coldly. "They tore down a house without proper permits. That's not just a mistake, it's fraud." Mike agreed to provide a signed statement, likely hoping to avoid charges himself. As I left his office, I could feel the pieces starting to fit together. Karen had not only ordered the demolition without proper paperwork, but she had also used a company that was clearly willing to go along with her questionable practices. I wasn't done yet. It was time to start talking to the neighbors. I hit the streets, knocking on doors and speaking to anyone who was willing to talk. At first, people were hesitant. They were afraid of what Karen might do if they spoke out. But the more I explained what had happened to Sarah's house, the more they began to open up. It didn't take long for me to start hearing horror stories. One elderly couple, the Johnsons, told me how Karen fined them $500 for having a bird feeder that wasn't aesthetically pleasing. Another neighbor, Mrs. Patel, shared how Karen had harassed her for having cultural decorations during a holiday. People were scared. Everyone was terrified of Karen, and for good reason. She had been using her position as HOA president to bully and control everyone in the neighborhood, targeting anyone who didn't follow her strict, often arbitrary rules. As I collected the stories, the picture became clearer. Karen was systematically using her position to control people, to make their lives miserable. She wasn't just a strict HOA president. She was a bully, and she had been running roughshod over the entire community. I knew this was going to be bigger than just Sarah's house. I started documenting everything, statements from neighbors, any incidents they were willing to share, and proof that Karen had been abusing her power for months. At the same time, I reached out to a few of my contacts, digging deeper into the HOA's activities. The more I learned, the more it became clear that Karen had created a reign of terror that stretched far beyond Sarah's home. This wasn't just a one-off. She'd been bullying homeowners, using threats and intimidation to get her way. I compiled all the evidence I had, everything from the signed statements to the confession from Mike Peterson. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about holding Karen accountable for her actions and making sure this kind of abuse never happened again. I needed to take this to the county attorney, James Martinez. I called him up and explained everything I'd uncovered. He listened carefully, and after a pause, he confirmed what I already knew. Liam, this is criminal. Destruction of property, fraud, abuse of power. We're talking serious charges. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was one thing to be angry, but it was another to know that the law was on our side. James assured me that they would get everything in order on their end. But I wasn't going to let up. We had a case now, and I wasn't going to stop until Karen Winters paid for what she did. It felt good to finally be making progress. But I wasn't done yet. I had to keep digging, keep gathering evidence, and make sure we didn't just catch Karen. We had to make sure this was going to be a case that would hold up in court and set an example for anyone else who thought they could abuse their power. With each new piece of information, I could feel the noose tightening around her. This wasn't just about my sister anymore. This was about standing up for every person Karen had bullied, every family she'd hurt. I drove back to Sarah's house later that day, my mind racing. We're getting closer, I told her. We've got the evidence, and I'm going to make sure Karen faces the consequences. It's time to make her pay for what she did. Sarah smiled faintly, but I could tell she was still struggling. I just want my life back, Liam, she said quietly. I nodded. And you will. We'll make sure of it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be over until Karen Winters was held accountable for everything she'd done. It was time to make her pay for her actions, and I wasn't going to stop until we did. As I sat in my office late that night, the weight of everything I had learned about Karen's reign of terror settled in. It wasn't just about Sarah's house anymore. It was about the community that had been suffering under the thumb of a woman who believed she could do whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted. People were scared to speak out. People were losing their homes, their possessions, their peace of mind. This wasn't just a case of negligence or misunderstanding. It was a calculated abuse of power. I knew what had to be done next. The evidence was mounting, and it was time to bring it all together. But to bring Karen down, I needed to expose her in a way that would leave no room for doubt. This wasn't going to be a quick confrontation or a private meeting. No, I needed the whole community to know what she had done. I needed the board members to see that they couldn't hide behind their fancy titles anymore. They had been complicit in this, whether they realized it or not. But to do this right, I couldn't act hastily. I needed to play my cards carefully. The trap needed to be set just right. I contacted the county attorney, James Martinez, and went over the evidence we had. Liam, this is worse than we thought, he said after reviewing everything. This isn't just about Sarah's house. This is systemic abuse of power. We need to make sure we have everything lined up before we go public with it. I agreed. We couldn't afford to rush. We needed a solid case, one that could withstand scrutiny and make sure Karen would face the consequences of her actions. James gave me the go-ahead to proceed, but he made one thing clear. We couldn't reveal all our cards just yet. The timing had to be perfect. Over the next few days, I worked tirelessly, gathering more evidence, cross-checking everything. I contacted neighbors and gathered more signed statements. I wanted to ensure that when we confronted Karen, she couldn't escape. And just when I thought I had everything I needed, I made a strategic move. I reached out to a local reporter, Dave Williams, who had covered several stories on local government issues before. He had a reputation for digging deep, and I figured if anyone could make this story blow up, it was him. I didn't give him all the details, just enough to get his attention. "I might have a story for you about a serious abuse of power within the Pinecrest HOA," I told him. "There might be some interesting developments at the next HOA meeting. I think you'll want to be there." Dave was intrigued, and he agreed to show up. I could already imagine the headlines: HOA president accused of illegally demolishing homes. The story would spread fast, but that was just one part of the plan. The other was setting the stage for Karen's downfall at the meeting. I knew she'd try to silence me, to brush off the accusations, but I had to make sure she couldn't weasel her way out of this. The day of the meeting arrived, and I was ready. Sarah had been anxious, but I reassured her. "Don't worry, we've got this. This is the beginning of the end for Karen," I said, trying to calm her nerves. We arrived early, and the room was buzzing with whispers. Word had already gotten out that something big was going to happen. I could see Karen at the front, her usual confident expression on her face. But there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. She knew something was coming, but she didn't know what. The meeting began, and Karen breezed through the early parts of the agenda. But as soon as my name was called, I could feel the tension in the air. "Next, we have Mr. Liam Johnson, who wishes to address the board regarding a demolition matter," Karen announced, her voice dripping with condescension. "You have 5 minutes," she added, her gaze fixed on me, challenging me to make my move. I stood up slowly, my heart racing, but my face calm. I walked to the front of the room, carrying a folder full of the evidence I had carefully compiled over the past few weeks. When I set the folder on the table in front of me, I could see Karen's eyes narrow, her fingers tapping impatiently on the desk. She was used to being in control, and this was a moment she had no control over. I cleared my throat and addressed the room, my voice steady. "I'm here today regarding the demolition of my sister's home at 742 Maple Street. It was done without proper permits, without legal authorization, and without any notice to the homeowner." I could see Karen's face redden, and I knew I had her attention. She immediately interjected, her voice sharp. "We've already addressed this matter privately, Liam," she said dismissively. "Your sister's home was in violation of multiple HOA regulations. I wasn't having any of it." "That's funny," I said, my tone cool but firm, "because I have here a statement from the City Records Department confirming that no demolition permits were ever filed for that address." I held up the document for everyone to see. The room grew quiet. People shifted in their seats. Karen's face turned pale as she realized the trap was closing. "Demolishing a house without a permit is illegal," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "It's a criminal offense." I could see the board members shifting uncomfortably. They were starting to realize the gravity of the situation. Karen wasn't as untouchable as she'd once thought. I wasn't done yet. "But that's not all," I said, turning the page in my folder. "I also have a signed confession from Mike Peterson, the owner of the demolition company. He specifically stated that Karen Winters personally authorized the demolition and assured him that all paperwork was in order, even though it wasn't. And she also instructed him to do it while my sister was out of town, deliberately timing it to cause the maximum amount of harm." I looked directly at Karen as I said the last part, and I could see her face flush with anger. "Liam, this is a smear campaign," Karen finally snapped, her voice rising with desperation. "These are just lies. You have no proof." But I wasn't backing down. I have 15 signed statements from homeowners in this community, I said, my voice steady but forceful, all detailing harassment, intimidation, and illegal fines you imposed on them. People are finally speaking out about what you've done, Karen. The murmurs in the room grew louder. The board members were now clearly divided. I could see Maria Gonzalez shift uncomfortably in her seat, and then, as if on cue, she spoke up. Actually, Karen, you didn't call a full board meeting to approve this demolition, Maria said, her voice shaky. You called an emergency session with just 3 of us, and none of us knew you were going to tear down the house. It was like a domino effect. One by one, Karen's allies began to backpedal. They were realizing that they couldn't defend her anymore. The weight of the evidence was too much. And then it happened, the moment that I had been waiting for. I also have proof that this was all orchestrated by you to eliminate a house that didn't fit your vision for the community, I said, pulling out a series of photographs. I passed them around the room, showing what Sarah's house had looked like just a month earlier, before the demolition. It was a well-kept, beautiful home, nothing like the eyesore Karen had claimed it to be. This is the eyesore you're referring to? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. A home that was well maintained, with a beautiful garden. What exactly did it threaten you? Karen stood up abruptly, her face contorted with fury. This meeting is adjourned, she shouted, her voice cracking. I need to speak to my attorney. But before she could make a move, I held up my hand and said, Sit down, Karen. You're not going anywhere. The room went silent. And then I made my final move. You see, Karen, I'm not just some random guy you can push around. I'm County Sheriff Liam Johnson, I said, pulling my badge from my pocket and holding it up for everyone to see. And everything you've done has been under investigation for weeks. You've committed multiple criminal offenses, and now, the entire HOA is going to be held accountable for your actions. The gasps in the room were almost deafening. Karen's face drained of color as the realization hit her. This wasn't just a legal issue anymore. It was a criminal one. She was done. As the officers stood in the doorway, waiting to escort her out, Karen's defiant attitude crumbled. You can't do this, she sputtered. But it was too late. I had already won. As the meeting descended into chaos, I stood there, watching Karen unravel in front of everyone. Her usual confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the frantic desperation of someone who knew she was about to lose everything. The room was filled with murmurs, people exchanging looks, unsure of how to process what had just been revealed. There were still a few board members sitting stiffly, trying to look unaffected, but the cracks were showing. Maria Gonzalez, one of the board members who had been too afraid to stand up to Karen in the past, was now shifting uncomfortably in her seat. She couldn't deny the truth anymore. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of guilt in her gaze. She wasn't the only one. Others at the table were starting to speak in hushed tones, clearly trying to distance themselves from Karen's actions. The truth was out, and there was no running from it. As Karen tried to regain some semblance of control, I stepped forward and addressed the room. The facts are clear, I said, my voice steady, ensuring everyone could hear me. Karen Winters used her position as HOA president to destroy my sister's home without any legal authority. This was no accident. It was deliberate, it was malicious, and it was illegal. The weight of my words hung in the air, and I could feel the room holding its collective breath. But this isn't just about one house, I continued. This is about a pattern of abuse of power that has gone unchecked for far too long. People here, people who are sitting in this room right now, have been terrorized by Karen for months, even years. It's time for this to end. I could hear murmurs from the audience, the community members who had come to support Sarah and hear the truth for themselves. The fear that had kept them quiet for so long was starting to dissolve. This wasn't just one man speaking up. It was a collective movement. I looked back at Karen, who was visibly shaken now, her face pale, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was as if the words that had been so easily spoken in the past, the threats, the fines, the demands, were suddenly lost on her. There was no way for her to talk her way out of this one. Her reign of terror was over. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the panic rising as she tried to figure out an escape route. But there was none. The evidence was overwhelming, the public support was undeniable, and I had made sure everything was out in the open. I could see it now. Karen wasn't just worried about the fallout from this meeting. She was terrified of what would happen when the law caught up with her. But even as the room waited for Karen's next move, I knew it was time for the final act. As of today, I said, the county attorney's office is filing criminal charges against Karen Winters for destruction of property, fraud, and abuse of power. The words hit hard. The room erupted in gasps, and I could see several board members sit back, visibly relieved that the pressure had finally been taken off them. The silence was almost unbearable, but it was clear. The tide had turned, and the community was no longer backing her. Karen was alone. But it wasn't just about her. It was about the entire HOA system that had allowed her to thrive on unchecked power for so long. The HOA itself is also under investigation for complicity in these actions, I added, making sure the board members knew they weren't off the hook either. You allowed this to happen. You stood by and let this woman destroy families. You're all responsible. The room was now filled with voices, a mix of anger, disbelief, and for some, relief. There was no going back now. Karen, still trying to cling to whatever semblance of control she had left, stood up abruptly. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound grating in the tense silence. "This is ridiculous," she spat, her voice shrill. "I was just doing my job, enforcing the rules. This isn't fair." But I wasn't letting her get away with it. "Karen, it's over," I said firmly. "You can't hide behind your position anymore. You've destroyed lives, and now you're going to face the consequences." She stood there, her face contorted in rage, but it was clear she was done. Her allies were disappearing one by one, the board members who had once supported her now silent, no longer willing to defend her actions. The weight of the truth had shattered her defenses, and all she had left was anger and desperation. But that wasn't going to change what was coming next. As I turned to leave, the doors opened, and 2 uniformed officers stepped into the room. They weren't there to arrest Karen, not yet. But they were there to make it clear that this was no longer just an HOA matter. This was a criminal investigation, and Karen had nowhere left to run. The officers approached her, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She had miscalculated everything. All the people she had terrorized over the years were no longer afraid. And now, the law was closing in on her. As the officers asked her to step outside to take her statement, she shot one last venomous glance at me. "This isn't over, Liam," she hissed, her voice trembling, but I just smiled, knowing that it was. Karen's time was up. Later, as Sarah and I left the meeting, we shared a quiet moment. "It's over," I said to her, though part of me still couldn't quite believe it. We had come so far, and now the battle was finally won. But there was still work to be done. I knew the investigation into Karen and the HOA was just beginning. The media would pick up on it, and the fallout would be felt across the county. This wasn't just about one person getting justice. It was about making sure this kind of abuse could never happen again. As the door to the meeting room closed behind us, I felt the weight of the moment settle in. We had won. But this was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the meeting rippled throughout the community. The investigation into the HOA was just getting started, but the public support for Sarah was overwhelming. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak out for years finally found their voice. They shared their stories with the press, and the media coverage was extensive. The local newspaper ran a story on the front page with the headline, "HOA President Accused of Illegally Demolishing Sheriff's Sister's Home." The story went viral, and soon, other communities across the state were contacting me, sharing their own stories of HOA abuses. As for Karen, the legal process moved quickly. With the mountains of evidence against her, her defense crumbled. She was charged with destruction of property, fraud, and abuse of power. Her lawyer tried to argue that the HOA bylaws gave her the authority to make decisions like this, but the evidence was undeniable. The demolition company's full cooperation with authorities, along with the signed statements from homeowners, left her with no way out. And when her trial came, it was brief. She pled guilty to reduced charges, hoping for a lighter sentence. But the judge wasn't lenient. "You abused the trust placed in you by your community," the judge said, sentencing Karen to 18 months in prison. The sentencing was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Karen's house, the one she had so smugly used to exert her power, was now in the hands of the county, and its proceeds would be used to compensate Sarah for her loss. The community, once fractured and fearful, began to rebuild. Robert Chin, the interim president, worked to implement changes within the HOA, introducing transparency and accountability that had been sorely lacking under Karen's rule. The board adopted term limits for its members, required full documentation for every decision, and set up mandatory waiting periods before enforcement actions could take place. Sarah's house, which had been reduced to rubble, was rebuilt with love and care. It was more beautiful than before, and the neighbors rallied around her, helping with the construction. They had come together, and for the first time in a long while, the fear that had once permeated the neighborhood seemed to fade. 3 months later, I drove by the community garden, the one Karen had wanted to establish, but now with proper approval, community input, and a sense of unity. It stood as a symbol of the change that had taken place. As I passed by, I couldn't help but think of how much had changed in such a short time. What started as an act of destruction had led to a complete transformation. I stopped the car and looked out at the garden. Sarah, standing next to me, smiled. "I never thought something good could come from all this," she said softly. I looked at her and nodded. "Sometimes it takes something terrible to make people realize they need to stand up against bullies," she chuckled. "Yeah, especially when they demolish the wrong house." I smiled, knowing that Karen's mistake had ultimately sparked something far greater than any of us could have imagined. What began as a fight for justice for Sarah had grown into a fight for the whole community. As we stood there watching the sunset, I thought about everything we had accomplished. Karen may have destroyed a house, but in doing so, she had helped bring a community together, unite people who had once been afraid to speak up. And in the end, that was the real victory.